So the irony this morning is we're not even going to talk about Acts. We've been in this series called Acts, but I've emptied everything that I had to say that study coming up to that week. But we are going to stay on that topic. In fact, what I want to get at this morning is, like, I suppose everything has the theory and then the actual doing. Like, there's the I'm going to climb that mountain, and then there's the climbing that mountain, or the I'm going to do this, and then there's the actual doing it. This week I was reminded when I was 7. The kid across the street from us, his name was Kevin Zimmerman. Isn't that funny how you remember things like that? You probably have your own childhood friend memories. Or how about this one? How many of you, I'm about to date some of you, but how many of you remember your childhood telephone number? It's weird, isn't it? Like, since you graduated high school, you've learned 3 phone numbers, but you still remember the one that you had when you were 562888729. That's what, you should call it afterwards and just see where it gets you. Like, call your childhood phone number and see where that leads. Anyway, so Kevin liked to wrestle, and I think that's why I said to my dad, "Hey, Dad, I want to wrestle this year." So my dad signed me up for wrestling, and I still remember going to the lower gym in the the Laurel Middle School, in this windowless pit where they'd put mats on the floor, and we would wrestle because we were 7. I mean, the only thing different was this was officially a sport. But then there was this day, and I don't remember whether it was days or weeks. What I do remember is pulling into the parking lot because my dad said, "There's no practice tonight, it's weigh-ins." I wasn't entirely sure what that meant other than the fact that it involved someone telling me how much I weighed. And so I remember pulling in and standing in the back of this very long line that led to this office. And as I was standing in that line, I learned something new. Well, I learned one thing I kind of knew, and that was that we were eventually going to get weighed. But then I learned something new, and what I learned was that at the end of that line was a 50-something hairy bearded guy who was going to tell me to strip down to my underwear and step onto the scale. And I didn't really have words for that opportunity, but fortunately I had tear ducts. And so that's what I did. I can still remember my dad kind of consoling me and trying to get me through, like, "No, you can do this." And I'm like, I was 17 years old and didn't like to take my shirt off in front of people. I am not doing this. Like, not that I knew that then, but that was the reality. And I think he was kind of buying himself some time. And then I watched this kid walk by in this leotard thing. And I was like, "What is that?" And he said, "That's called a singlet." And I said, "What do you do in that thing?" He said, "That's the uniform." And again, I didn't have words, but I had tear ducts, and I had an ability to panic, and my next memory is standing at the car, and my wrestling career was over. Like, there was no way I was going to be a part of any of those things, which isn't to be commentary on those of you who maybe were, because the next thing I learned is that I wasn't tough enough to wrestle, because the wrestlers would kick everybody else's butt. But it's that reminder, like, in everything, there's the idea, and then there's the doing, right? And there's the ambition, and then there's the follow-through. And what I want to try to accomplish this morning, I'm hoping it's not too mechanical, is to take this conversation we've been having with this type 1 versus type 2 starting over and move from the theory of it to the actual hard work of it. Now, if you've not been with us, what we've been exploring is that there's at least a couple kinds of starting over. There's type 1 starting over, which we've said, type 1 starting over, the imagery that comes with it is that everything went up in a ball of flames, but we emerged alive. You know, the business failed, the marriage failed, someone we loved died, we moved to a new town. Like, somehow, in ways that oftentimes are outside of our control, we're left figuring life out all over again. That's type 1, and certainly a part of life, and a part of life all of us are probably going to experience for better or for worse, whether we like it or not. But we've been exploring in these last couple of weeks, and what I think the book of Acts is really getting at is type 2 starting over. And what type 2 starting over says is it's not a ball of flames. In fact, it's ironic. Because type 2 starting over becomes necessary because to some degree we've been successful. You've been successful, whether that's, and this could be in any number of things. To some degree, your business has been successful. Your pursuit of being in physical shape has been successful. Your pursuit of some hobby or some interest has become successful. And that success has created momentum. But type 2 starting over kicks into gear when you realize that momentum's actually ironically taking you off course. So the good news is everybody at work thinks you're amazing. The bad news is everybody at home thinks you're a jerk. Right? Like the good news is you're getting a lot of work done. The bad news is your physical shape is deteriorating very rapidly. That's type 2 starting over. The good news is you're popular at school. The bad news is you've kind of lost your soul because your moral compass is all out of whack. So what we're talking about is what happens when a person realizes, like, wait a minute, all outward signs are that I'm succeeding, but inwardly I have this sense that I'm failing. I talked to a good friend in this process who talked about his medical practice and just that within a couple years what he realized was from the externals, everything was awesome because he had all kinds of patients, but internally what he knew was that he was giving poor care because he was too busy and he was treating his staff poorly. So that's this type 2 starting over conversation. And the question that I want to ask this morning really amounts to what degree would a look at the narrative of Jesus' life help us begin to find some handles to actually doing this? So my hope this morning is to push us from the idea to the doing. This might help. C.S. Lewis, and this kind of points to the direction we're going. C.S. Lewis, which may or may not be a name you know, he's the author of Chronicles of Narnia, and in Christian circles thought to be one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century. He said it this way. He said, only a lazy person is busy. Which you could only say that, like I'd never stand up here, you'd all leave. But C.S. Lewis says it and we're all like, oh, wow, that's thought-provoking. His point was that the only way you arrive at that place where you identify yourself as busy is if you lack the kind of internal fortitude and discipline to identify what are the things you need to stop doing. And that's the conversation that I want to provoke, though perhaps a little uncomfortable. Jesus seems to do it in John 15. In John 15, he grabs what would have been in his day some familiar images to create a really simple but incredibly difficult conversation. He says, I'm the true vine and my Father is the gardener. Now, perhaps helpful to remind ourselves that the Bible's written for us but not to us. He's not writing to people who buy their groceries at Costco. He's writing to people who grow their groceries, and if they're unsuccessful in that endeavor, their kids die to a large extent. He's writing to a people who would have known what it was like to have a grapevine. Many of these families would have had their own. Wine wasn't just a novelty that you had on holidays. Wine was a way of keeping your family alive because it was a way of treating the water that otherwise would get you killed. And so this image of taking care of a vine would have been very, very familiar. It'd be like saying, like cutting the lawn, mowing the yard. Very familiar ideas. In fact, remember also that this was a multi-generational mindset. They didn't think of themselves as themselves. They thought of themselves as a bigger story. Like Hushka was the bigger deal than Adam, so to speak. They were taking care of a grapevine that in all likelihood had been planted by a great-great-great-grandfather. And the process that Jesus is going to describe, in some ways, it isn't going to make or break whether or not they get enough wine, but it very much will make or break whether or not their kids or their grandkids get enough grapes to produce enough wine to keep their family alive. So he continues, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. That's the type 1 starting over. And at the risk of being trite, that's the easy part, right? And I guess part of what I'm hoping this series provokes in all of us, if nothing else, is this realization that that's not pruning. Like that's common sense. We ought not pat ourselves on the back when we identify, although it's important, some kind of destructive tendency that we get rid of. Like when we identify a sin and we go, I got to stop doing this, that's important, but it's not actually the crucial thing that Jesus is getting at in this passage. He keeps going. He cuts off every branch of me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he takes care of and makes sure that it produces healthy fruit, right? No, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, and there's the word, so it will be even more fruitful. This is the counterintuitive, though potentially patronizing conversation that I'm hoping we're beginning to have. Because what Jesus is identifying here is a process by which we look at money-making entities. We look at things in our lives that get praised by people. We look at activities that we do that matter, that serve people, that are good activities. And we go, I think it's got to go. That's the troubling piece about this. See, what they would have known, the original audience, was that the older a vine becomes, the greater its potential for producing grapes. That they would have known that reality happening, it only actually happens if you prune. In fact, Bruce Wilkerson points out in a book on this very topic that the older a vine gets, the more pruning that it requires. So here's the bad news coming away from this conversation this August, is if you really dig into this and you really do the work and you really cut some stuff away and you really recenter, it doesn't last forever. It means you probably have to do it again next year and the year after that. And the older you get, it seems to be the suggestion, the more crucial it becomes and the more of it is required of you. He keeps going. I'm the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Now, certainly what Jesus is talking about here is a relationship with God through him. But notice he's making a promise. And notice, see, we want faith to mean like, do I believe in this abstract idea called the Trinity? Do I believe in this thing called some other theological principle? For Jesus, faith is this. Do you trust that if you get rid of these three things that you know you're going to disappoint people when you get rid of them and you know they're fruitful and you're not sure how you're going to look those people in the eye again, do you trust that God is not only leading you to that, but doing so will result in an even more fruitful life? And to that extent, a more concerted, energetic connection to God and the kingdom. That's the promise he's getting at, which gets us moving towards that question, what has to go? And as we dig deep and we see these things that we love, do we have the capacity to go, wait a minute. Every good idea has a shelf life. Every great thing deteriorates in its value. Do we have the ability to disappoint people? I'll never forget my friend Vern standing on the stage one day and saying, I'm coming to the realization, I just want people to like me, but I'm in the business of making people mad. This is what he's getting at. Now, there was an example that played itself out for me this last week, and it has the risk to sound braggadocious. I guess ultimately you get to judge that. But obviously this process that we're in is personal to me and therefore personal to us as we're analyzing different things, even to the extent that we've said like, hey, we're not going to do 3 gatherings next year. We're going to stick with 9 and 10:30, not because we don't necessarily need them, but because we feel like we're drifting into succeeding in some areas that we never sought out to succeed in. And we think there's some areas we can tighten up and serve the same number of people. Well, last Sunday was one of the most exhausting messages I've ever got to deliver because I loved the content but couldn't figure out how to say it and was kind of a wreck in the process. Monday morning, I'm usually pretty good about not looking at my email because Monday's my day off. But in this case, I had some stuff listed on Craigslist, which is synonymous for I was soliciting frauds to text me and make all kinds of offers. It's like strangest world, that Craigslist. Anyway, I was waiting for a guy to email me back because I was supposed to meet him at Walgreens, and I was still deciding whether I was going there to get shot or going there to sell something. So I checked my email, and there was an email that, you know how that happens, like you say you're going to do one thing, and 30 minutes later, you squirrel, and you've gone this other direction. Well, there was an email that was unlike any email I've ever received in my life, and I'm not convinced I'll ever receive one again, and therefore, in my own trying to construct my world and understand God, I think this was very much what we would say a God thing. It was an email from a recruiter. Now, most sectors have these. Church certainly does, where, in fact, in some part, that's how we were able to get connected with Kate. Like, there's organizations out there that you can partner with who go, hey, we want to hire this person. Will you go find them for us? This was from a recruiter who was asking me to please apply for a position at another church in another town that's a bigger town and a bigger church, kind of a flagship church in the town, where I'd be the associate teaching pastor, but the idea was that it's kind of an heir apparent deal. I gather that the leader is getting old, as they say. And I looked at the email, and of course my first inclination was I was flattered. And then I just talked about like celebrate the opportunity before you make a decision. But I didn't need to celebrate anything because I was flattered, and that was what I needed there. But honestly, it took me about 10 seconds to go like, no way, not interested. So came around to Tuesday, and I try to answer my emails at about 11:30 after I've got some other stuff done. And so I was answering emails, and I needed to, of course, respond to this person's email. And I wanted to at least, do them and God justice by attending to the details of the email. And as the more I read the email and the description, the more it was clear that this is a church with a big building and lots of services and lots of activities and wildly successful in its town. And it's a very successful church and thus a very humbling opportunity. And yet the more I read, the less interested I was. In fact, one of the irony was we have 3 services on Sunday and then middle school in between, and then Monday we have this and Tuesday we have this, and I was just reading this going, you're an example of everything that's successful in church world, and yet I couldn't be less interested as I'm reading this description more and more. And it caused me to begin to reflect on this very thing. Adam, that's why we're doing this work. Because that's who we become if we don't do it. Now, that's not to say that's wrong. Not for a second have we ever said that we're the only ones doing church right in Helena, or even that we're the only good church in Helena. We've always maintained there are lots of great churches in Helena, Fresh Life and First Assembly and the Cathedral and Our Lady of the Valley, and there's some that I'm forgetting, and I'm not doing that on purpose, but there's great churches in Helena. It's never been the goal to be the only one. It has been the goal to be a very specific one, that gathers on Sunday and gives our best energy to creating conversations that matter for those of us who follow Jesus and hopefully matter for our friends who are deeply suspicious about church. And then to go, let's get the heck out of here. And let's try to just organically serve people. And periodically, let's bring it together and serve together. But it's always been the goal to keep it that simple. Not because it's the only thing that's right, but because it's what we've always felt compelled to. And as I was reading this description, it was just affirmed to me like, that's what we're trying to push against. Like, for better or for worse, that's what we're drifting toward. And to some level, what we have is working. And to drift towards it would be tragic. I was reminded even this summer, like we've seen some success from this. There are at least a couple families around Narrate who were deeply impacted by the flooding. And if I think about it enough, I get insecure because I didn't lift a finger to help them. But what I know is there are people who stepped into the vision of this place, who came to Narrate, started serving, because we've always said, you want to get connected, come serve with us, and you'll find relationship, not overnight, but over time. And the good news is you'll actually like them because we won't have just created that relationship for you. And what we've seen play itself out this last spring over the flooding was in both cases, these families very much rallied around and supported by people, in many cases that they met around this place, but I never got an email. We didn't develop a, hey, your basement flooded program or ministry. And there's not that there's anything that would be wrong with that. We just didn't. I recalled the journey of our friend Lisa, who tragically passed from cancer this last summer. And again, we didn't have a cancer ministry. What we had is a friend who volunteered around this place and got deeply connected. And as she went through all the stages of everything she had to experience, there was this beautiful rallying that happened. Why? Because we had this idea of going, let's just try to keep it simple and not about religion. And I guess my point here is this. To whatever degree pruning is scary, I think part of what Jesus is getting at in John 15 is it's what keeps the real thing the real thing. I don't know what dreams you had when you were in college. I don't know the way you and your spouse talked when you first got married. I didn't know what you were hoping would be your reality when you got into middle school or high school. I don't know what hopes you had when you started your business or when you took that new job. What Jesus seems to know is that there's a natural process that happens. And it's as organic as anything. And that is more and more and more and more growth. And if you're not careful, you arrive at a place where you don't even recognize the thing you started with. Not because you failed, because you've succeeded to such a great extent that a guy like C.S. Lewis has to come along and go, you're lazy. That's the problem. You've never taken the time to grab the pruning shears, walk out there, evaluate what you have, and look at 75% of the fruit from your vine and go, I'm trusting that in getting rid of you, I create greater nutrients, greater sunlight for the main thing. And in the not too distant future, we'll have more, better, and new fruit because I'm trusting this process. You know, Jesus goes after this in Mark too, but it's a little more aggressively. We're going to talk about Mark 9 in particular a little bit in this next series that we're going to do in September. But Mark 9 is a transition in the book where following Jesus goes from relatively difficult to extraordinarily difficult. And part of the transition in Mark 9 is Jesus looking at his disciples going, okay, it's about to get hard. Well, one of the things that happens is Jesus' disciple John bumps into a group of people who are driving out demons in Jesus' name. And he stops them. And he goes, wait a minute, you didn't go to that seminary. You don't hang out with Jesus. You don't have his badge. You didn't get his credential. You don't have that license. You can't do that. And John comes to Jesus and he's bragging to him like, hey, I saw these guys casting out demons in your name, but they're not a part of the club, so I told them to stop. And Jesus says this, if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me to stumble, it'd be better for them if a large millstone were hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. Maybe in our vernacular, if they put concrete boots on and were thrown into the Missouri. What he's getting at here is like, that's a disease, John. The disease, if you're not a part of our little club, you can't possibly have God, right? That's a disease, and we don't do that disease. And then he continues. You want to be a part of my club? Let's talk, is more or less what he's going. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life maimed than with two hands to go into hell where the fire never goes out. Now, hell can be a trigger for many of us. Let me just talk for a second about that and ultimately say, if you want to get together and have that conversation about hell and the theology of hell, I'd love to do that. I think it's a fascinating conversation, especially because I think traditional biblical Christian orthodoxy allows for several different answers to that question. What we know is that hell is a translation of Gehenna, and that was a literal physical place outside of Jerusalem. It was the transfer station. It was the dump. It was perpetually on fire because they didn't count on things decomposing. They just burned it. At the very least, what Jesus is getting at here is there's a way of life that's completely wasted. There's a way of living that causes you to go, that was a waste. And he's saying, rather than do that, if you've got to cut off a hand, do that. And if your foot caused you to stumble, cut it off. To which we go, wait a minute, I thought a foot comes from God. I thought a foot is a good thing. Yeah, that's the trick here. It is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell. Now, if we make the assumption that Jesus isn't being literal, we're left with the question, what in the world is he getting at? Here's a suggestion. What if he's looking at his guys going, hey, and gals, there were gals in that crew too. There's a war going on. Like, what you do with your life matters. It matters forever. God is on the move. Evil is on the move. Don't forget that. I heard a story of a man who lived in London during the intense bombing of London during World War II. And he was close enough to his house coming home from work to see a Nazi bomber drop a bomb that landed directly on his house. So he was far enough away to be safe, close enough to see it happen. And as the story is told, he stood there and watched his house evaporate, burn to the ground. He apparently went and stayed with a friend that night. The next day, he decided he needed to get some more clothes because the only thing he owned was what he was wearing. And of course, there was no Amazon or Target or anything like that. It was an era where you went to a store and you asked a person to retrieve every item you were asking for. And so as he was asking for socks and underwear and shoes, the full gamut of it, eventually this woman, sensitive to the war efforts and its need for everybody's collaboration, looked at him and said, "Sir, excuse me, but are you not aware that there's a war going on?" Implication being, of course, that he was being a little frivolous. And he just looked at her and said, without being smug, "Yeah, actually I am." What if what Jesus is getting at here is there's a war going on, and it requires that you have the ability to differentiate the good from the great? What if what he's saying is to really be a productive kingdom bringer and experiencer of God requires this ability to go, that's good, that's good, that's good, and they all need to go. Yeah, they're from God. Yeah, they're not even sin. What if Jesus is pointing out this very same thing I think C.S. Lewis is getting at, that one of the real differentiators between those who are highly productive and those who are not are those that have the ability to look at good things and get rid of them in order to allow for the great things that God is speaking to. Andy Stanley says things like, every great idea has a shelf life. No matter how good it was, no matter how productive it was, they all eventually become less productive. What if Jesus is asking these hard questions because he knows that with success comes opportunity, and with opportunity comes the sense of a mandate, and if you're not careful, you're not doing God's bidding anymore, you're doing a bunch of people that you like, their bidding for them. Maybe even yourself, maybe even your own ego. You know, Jim Collins, and if you want to dig into this deeper, Jim Collins' book, Great by Choice, is one of the most influential books I've ever read. He speaks on this level in some really awesome ways. He's one of the best business thinkers in the world today. He taught at Stanford. I was thinking this week, having listened to him as much as I have, I would put money on the table that if you were to hire him to be your own personal coach, or if your organization was to hire him and come in and coach your organization, I'd put money on the table that the first question, or at least the first couple questions he would ask you, would be this: what's on your stop doing list? Because the way he speaks implies that he knows that people like you and I, we're ambitious and aggressive enough, we're going to find things to do. Successful businesses, successful leaders in their work, people like you and I, we're going to constantly have a to-do list. But what separates the good from the great, according to Jim Collins, isn't do you have things to do, but have you developed the capacity to go, a foot's a good thing, but in this case, I think it's in my way. Do you have the capacity to differentiate the good things from the great things that God is speaking to you about? Now, how do we actually know? And to whatever degree it's helpful, I just kind of summarize the process I've been in for the last 6 months or so into a few questions which don't come from the Bible. They're completely subjective, but it might provoke conversation. And the first one for me, I'm realizing, is my output greater than my input? I guess I'm a bit of a traditionalist in the sense that I firmly believe that my time in the text and prayer and centering and some of those different spiritual disciplines, and I think they can happen in lots of forms, that they're essential. My friend Fred used to have a sign on his water cooler that said this. Go to that next slide. It said, warning to Christian leaders, if your output is greater than your input, then your input will become your downfall. I'm of the conviction, and you get to make your own decisions, that if I'm so busy that I don't have time to center with things like scripture and centering prayer and whatever those things you know they are, exercise, if I'm too busy for that stuff, then I've kind of got my answer. I'm too busy. I think of it in terms of I'm operating off of a checking account. And yeah, I could live for the next 6 months on deposits that I made for the last 6 months, but what about January? What about March? If I haven't made a deposit for 6 months, I'm going to be toast. The other question that I ask myself is this, and I'm sorry to be so blunt. I don't mean to be in any ways trite, but it's just the best way I knew to ask it. And I even asked a sixth grader's mom if it was okay to say, and she said yes. So I'll give you her email if you're mad. Just this question though: Am I haunted by the sense of half-assing everything? You know the feeling, right? And sometimes does life require it? Yeah, of course it does. But if I find myself in this perpetual cycle of, for me, it's weddings and funerals and Sundays and things like that. If I just catch myself in this perpetual cycle of going through motions, I don't want to live there long term. I'm convinced that it's not so much about talent as it is about grit. I'm convinced that engagement and passion are the important things, and I just don't want to be another one of those numb people doing a chaplaincy in the world and out of an obligation, not out of this personal connection to it. Which gets to this third one, am I feeling disconnected from what I'm doing? Now, this, I think, my opinion, this gets at the trickiest part of the whole pruning thing. Because if I determine I'm disconnected from it, the natural inclination would be, I got to stop doing it. But the problem is, that might not be the problem. The problem might be this other thing that's actually taking my energy, that's actually a waste of time, but I can't identify that. In tree pruning, you have the main branches, the single central leaders, and you have suckers. Those things that you see growing off your tree, even if they're 80 years old. They're energy wastes. And what you do in tree pruning is you get rid of the suckers, not the single central leaders, the main branch. So for me, it played itself out this way. This last summer, I realized I was kind of failing and getting bored with listening to podcasts. Now, I've talked before in my own rule of 5 and the things I need to do every day. Podcasts are part of that. I'm a plagiarist for a living. I'm a content curator for a living. I can't read enough. Even just my own personal, the way I'm wired, I need to be learning and stimulated by that stuff. So one of my things is I have to listen to a podcast every day. Well, what I realized is for several months, I was failing to do that. Not every day, but about half the time. Well, the problem wasn't like, okay, so I'm going to stop listening to podcasts because I'm disconnected. The problem was actually over here. And that was this thing called Broncos radio and ESPN radio and any number of other trivial things that I would listen to talking on the phone, especially during baseball season. I could talk endlessly with my friends who coach about 11-year-old baseball strategy, and I love the friendship, but there was this point where you go like, wait a minute. If I cut those things out, then my appetite for these things comes back. I think that becomes the real crucial thing. And let me just end with this to whatever degree it's helpful. Because ironically, I heard this one on a podcast, and this was the one where when I started bullet pointing answers to it, it actually led me to this place where I went like, there's no way I would focus on how high could we build the mountain. And it was this: if I knew I was going to die in a month, a year, 5 years, 10 years, what would I do? Now, I know that's as cliche as it gets and therefore as easily to be forgotten as anything. But I challenge you. You grab a piece of paper, you grab your phone, you open an Evernote, however it is you process, and you start forcing yourself to answer those questions. And my experience is God will lead you to the branches that need to go and the ones that he's trying to protect. And here's my question to you. Could you imagine if you could be the kind of person who 5 years from now didn't hate your job and mostly hate your life, but kind of enjoyed the paycheck? But could you imagine being the kind of person that when you graduate from college, you swore you would be? Could you imagine if you're the kind of person that was still emotionally connected to the work that you do, to the things God invites you into every day? Could you imagine if you were the kind of person who when you graduated high school, accomplished the goals, rather than was categorized with all the people who got distracted by other things? What's it going to take? Well, if you want a different kind of outcome, you have to have a different kind of investment. And could you imagine what it would be like to be a community of people? And this is what we're working on. This is what I'm working on. Could you imagine what it would be to be a 10, 11, 12-year-old church that kind of felt still like an immature church plant? Like, what about small groups? Yeah, we don't do any of that stuff. Well, I mean, it all happens. We don't organize anything. What do? We basically just get together on Sundays, and after that, everybody's on their own. Could you imagine what it would be like to be the kind of church who 10, 15 years in, didn't just Christian subculture out, but continued to form relationships with people and organizations in our community where we served together? Where people are looking at us going like, wait a minute, I didn't know that Christians cared about that. Can you imagine what it would be like to be the kind of person who'd been volunteering at a church for 15 years, but you didn't feel obligated to? You wanted to. As hard as pruning is, it sure seems like I am the vine, as God is saying. Trust me. It's the process he's leading us into. This process by which the fruit is greater and the connection with the kingdom profound. Let me pray. God, thanks, Lord, for who you are, and that even you yourself, and just taking a narrative look at your life, we see this play itself out. You experienced success, and you experienced strategic pruning, and that said nothing of the value you placed on people, but everything of the value you placed on your Father's voice. God, we all know what it's like to be surrounded by exhausted, disconnected people who are doing the right things, but don't really care about any of it. Lord, if we could just be a little bit of the salt in our community, on our teams, in our classrooms, at our jobs, in our families, in our friend groups. If we could just be among those who do the hard work of paying close attention to what is and isn't your priority for us, we would sure love to be that example in our community. God, I think of the semi-dormant dreams and ambitions and goals and the danger that they're in from the busyness of life, and just ask that you would protect that. Give us the types of courage, the type of connection with you, the types of friends that would help us be about the right things, not just the good things. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.